Hi, and welcome to Wheaton College's Core Book Podcast. Wheaton College is an interdenominational Christian college where we pursue faith and liberal arts learning with passion. Core Book is Wheaton's community reading program associated with our Christ at the Core curriculum. Each year we select a book and invite students, faculty, staff, alumni, parents, neighbors near and far, all communities associated with the college to join in. Believing that we read better in community, we create materials to support readers and plan scholarly and creative events to bring readers together. You can find out more at www.wheaton.edu/corebook. As for this Core Book podcast, this is our first season, a 10-episode read-through of the 2024-2025 Core Book, Homer's Odyssey, with Professor of Classical Languages Alex Loney and Professor of English Ben Weber. Our purpose is to provide accompaniment, community, and nerdy joy to readers near and far. I'm your host, Tiffany Eberle Kriner. Let's read. Now is the time for the portion of our show where we invite students to remind us what happens in the books under discussion for this episode. These sassy student summaries, written by Aequitas Fellows in the Public Humanities and Arts, should get us all on the same page.
In books 11 and 12, Odysseus is in the middle of telling the Phaeacians the admittedly kind of epic tale of his adventures. Circe tells him he has to make a quick pit stop to the underworld. There, some blind guy tells Odysseus, no matter what, do not let your men eat Helios' cows. And Odysseus is like, no sweat, I see, no cows, no problems. And then, after running into various angsty ghosts, makes his way back to the living world. Then Odysseus sails past an island of half-bird, half-human creatures who sing a nice little song that makes people want to kill themselves. But don't worry, thanks to good old-fashioned earplugs and rope, everyone made it out alive. Well, everyone who isn't eaten by the six-headed sea monster that randomly shows up. But regardless, most of the crew makes it to a safe-looking island where they decide to have a nice little snack. Said snack, however, just so happens to be the very cows that the blind guy from the underworld told him not to eat, Helios's. And Zeus ends up killing everyone except Odysseus, who just floats in the middle of the sea for a while before washing up on Calypso's island, which, in case you forgot, was where he started in Book 1 of the Odyssey.
Shall we move on to Book 11?
Let's do it.
All right. So every hero has to pass through the land of the dead, processing the sorrow of life in thinking through his journey, but also a major stage because he has to find out Tiresias' prophecy.
Right. And this has this, as you're saying, right? Every hero, there's a certain kind of tradition, sometimes called a katabasis, which literally means sort of going down or walking down. Kata, bino, to walk or go. So he has to go down into the underworld. In some sense, it's actually ambiguous what's going on here, if he's going into the underworld or if he's just sort of raising ghosts in some place that's near the underworld. You kind of get both parts of that here. But in any case, it's like some kind of descent into the underworld, and lots of other heroes get to do this, including, if you listen to Dante, Jesus, right? He'll go down and have this harrowing of hell, to some extent, right? A kind of Christian version of this thing.
And the first figure he meets is Elpenor, and as we've talked about, he asks Odysseus to not leave him there unburied, but heap a mound there where they burn his body, and then fix into his tomb the ore he used. So that makes sense, right? That's a kind of next step. But how do we understand the structure here? Because as I'm reading through, first of all, this is a massive number of people that he encounters. I'm not surprised, Dante and then T.S. Eliot, I had not thought death had undone so many, to consider that big list. But we've got Elpenor, his mother, then the prophecy, and then all of these women who come after, and then some heroes. So can we talk through the structure? The Elpenor part feels logical to me. His mom feels sort of logical. Right, a close figure to him personally. Tiresias is the purpose. That's good. Then we're done, right? He's got what he needs in a way. So then it pushes us with all these other things. So help me out. I don't understand why there are more.
One reason is that there's a certain kind of aesthetic justification in the sense of, now if you're going down to the underworld, might as well use this as a moment to sort of bring up everybody's favorite people, like Achilles, and we get these visions of other people who are sort of punished in the underworld.
Yeah, and I would push that even further and say that if part of the justification that the poem itself has offered for poets is that they have this divinely inspired knowledge of things, then both for Odysseus within the poem as a poet, but also for the rhapsode who's extemporizing, reciting this, just showing off how much you know is kind of a big deal, right? I mean, if a poet is in some way a guardian or a maker of culture, then the capacity of your poet is a really important thing. I have always thought that in some of the passages that are more dense with names, I always think in terms of Chaucer and the Legend of Good Women. But at the end of that section, there are some parts that are really dense with names. And if you are composing the poem in your mind on the fly from a sort of combination of things you know and then these pre-existing like formulae or half lines you've memorized, passages really dense with names are tough. You really got to know your stuff in order to fit those names into the lines if you have 2-3 names per line. And so it's a way of showing off in part, but not unlike Odysseus with the Cyclops. We always think of showing off as a bad thing. This sort of showing off is not necessarily a bad thing. It's showing that you know what poetry is for and that you respect it.
Okay, so there's a kind of grandiosity. He's really pulling out all the stops in the Land of the Dead to show the stories he knows and to be able to refer to them. I could not help but wonder why the mother is the first of many women and how those stories went together. And confronting his mom, he sort of thinks through, why did you die? Oh my gosh, you're dead. Why did you die? And she dies for loss of grief, or for loss of him, for grief. Yeah. And tells him then important stuff about the home life, right? So she has an important purpose narratively too. She stands firm about Penelope. She's still with you. And kind of gives him all the news there. But that's a really interesting thing. Why did you die? For loss and grief. Then when we go to the next person, we've got Tyro who falls in love with a river. Poseidon took his form and lay with her, right? So we've got a woman who is taken by a god and she bears him children. That happens several more times in these list of women who are sort of taken by gods. And it doesn't always say how they died, but several of them, I don't know how to say the name, but Epicaste, who crosses the gates of Hades, hangs herself for sorrow as part of her engagement with the sort of divine world. And so all of these women have a relationship to the gods that causes their suffering or causes their meaning and suffering, right? Their motherhood and their suffering. I just note that and wonder about it and wonder why there's that kind of unity there and so much space given to it. If you want to know some people whose suffering seems to be directly related to the gods, well, it would be this very personal way that the gods have been involved in their lives.
One line that I feel at least helps me a little bit with this section, although I don't know if it's the answer, is the last thing the shade of Odysseus' mother says to him after that really just terribly poignant, tragic scene where he tries and fails 3 times to embrace her. And that, like, the threefold failed embrace is one of the great contributions of the Odyssey to the literary tradition, right? That gets done and redone. The language there, too, is so beautiful. But the last thing she says is, remember all these things so one day you can tell them to your wife. There's actually something here that Penelope needs to know, or that Penelope could profitably know that Odysseus is meant to carry back to her. And more on that later, because I think there are a couple of moments later in the poem that are really remarkable in the way that they sort of treat Penelope almost without treating Penelope. But you're talking about women who are caused to suffer by the gods, and certainly Penelope would belong in that category as well.
To say you're not alone, then?
Possibly, yeah.
Right, like this is how it is for women. And of course, the ending woman, though, is one who is the kind of negative exemplum. The one, I think, negative exemplum here, although I should read it again more closely, perhaps. Phaedra, Procris, and the lovely daughter of dangerous Minos, Ariadne, Theseus tried to bring her back from Crete to Athens, but could not succeed. The goddess Artemis killed her on the Isle of Dia when Dionysus spoke against her. Then came Maira, Clymene, and Eriphyle. Accepting golden bribes, she had killed her husband. That idea of the one who kills her husband.
Right, we're back to Agamemnon.
We're back, exactly so. I'm interested in that last tiny little hint, like, maybe don't do that. So Odysseus' mom is not going to want Penelope to kill him, but he sort of breaks off there at that moment. And
Yeah.
then-
We
and
kinda step back,
Arete
interestingly.
speaks. Yeah.
we
Go ahead.
step back from the story, right? We've been going on for 2.5 books, and all of a sudden we're back out
That's right.
Yeah.
into the third person again. The whole thing kind of cuts out. And here we get Odysseus, Alcinous, and Arete, this exchange. And he is favorably compared again to a poet here. He's sort of enchanting them with his storytelling.
Especially Arete, the woman. So she has been hearing all the stories of the women too.
Yeah. And this is the moment, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that Arete sort of does what her name says she does,
That's
right?
true.
Don't scrimp on his gifts. His need is great. Great as the riches piled up in your houses thanks to the gods' goodwill. This seems to be the moment where she at least declares that she wants to grant what he's after.
Yeah, I always thought this is kind of a moment where he's like, my story's incomplete. Now complete it for me. I'm kind of at the farthest away from home at this point in the story. But you can have a role too. It's like, help me finish the story by letting me get home.
And then they don't let him. Is the rest of this an encore? King Alcinous, there's a time for many tales, but also a time for sleep. If you still want to hear, I will not grudge you stories. I will tell you some even more distressing ones about my friend who managed to escape the shrieks and battled in at Troy, but perished later, killed in his own home by an evil wife. Odysseus cannot get over this little moment that he stops with, and he comes right back into it with the story of Agamemnon there. So is this what we've been waiting for? Or is this an encore? What is this? What are the heroes, the suffering heroes, add to this, now that we've talked through the women?
So I'll start by saying it feels to me a bit like books 5 through 8, at least on my reading, where first there's the part of the poem that sort of deals with the women and kind of the female side of the domestic arrangement, and then we move on to the men. And so here again, it seems like we're moving on to the men. So Alcinous needs his stories too.
Yes.
But it is true that also the men, Agamemnon and Achilles, these are people Odysseus knows. And so, I think that they add that. If we're thinking about what he says about this whole story, that I have to rehearse these sorrows again and feel them again. Story is a means of processing grief. Personal knowledge being so important that this part of Book 11, it fits with all those things, I think, really well.
So we want to talk about, we've seen Agamemnon several times, that story.
Yeah, the one thing I'll say about Agamemnon, because we mentioned this earlier, he gives that advice, never indulge your own wife too far. I personally am inclined to doubt that Agamemnon has any good advice to offer about how to be married to a woman. I actually find that moment kind of funny. I think Achilles is much more important, and so I'm happy to pass it on.
Especially
but I wanted to note
since
that.
he contradicts what Odysseus' mom has just said. Tell her everything later.
That's right. Yeah, just tell her a part of it. Be sure to hide the rest. Not that you will be murdered by your wife. It gets that point that even here in this land of prophecy, Odysseus is receiving conflicting advice. And part of what he as a hero needs to do is to figure out what the right course of action is.
All right, so Achilles then?
Achilles.
We meet the Achilles, greatest of Greek heroes.
That's right. And I always find this to be one of the saddest and most beautiful parts of this entire poem. Partially for what Achilles represents. So we've talked a lot about the violence versus craft, metis versus manus conflict in this poem. And when Odysseus comes face to face with Achilles, that sort of really crystallizes that debate. But also Agamemnon too, right? Agamemnon just wants to hear about his son. Do you know about Orestes? Achilles just wants to hear about his son. What about Neoptolemus? What I was saying earlier about legacy, that even for these great heroes, what they leave behind them is so important, and that's all their shades want to know about. And it's, on the one hand, I think very beautiful, but also very sad.
There's another level of sadness potentially here, which is to say, what do we make of Achilles rejoicing in hearing the news of his son? Because it begins with this section where Odysseus addresses him. He finds the shade of Achilles, and he says something like, lines 483 and following, Achilles, no man before has been more blessed than you, nor ever will be. Before, when you were alive, we, Argives, honored you as we did the gods, and now, in this place, you have great authority over the dead. Do not grieve even in death, Achilles. Achilles will say, "O shining Odysseus, never try to console me for dying. I would rather follow the plow as thrall to another man, one with no land allotted him and not much to live on, than be a king over the perished dead." And then he asked about his son. That little exchange is sort of curious. I'll put it that way. What do you take as the nature of Achilles' rebuke of Odysseus's commendation of him there?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So I'll go ahead and just throw out a strong thesis and we'll see how that goes. I think one possibility that presents itself is that we could almost read this as a rebuke not just of Odysseus, well, sort of a rebuke of Odysseus for his, construction, but also of the glory at all costs ethos of the Iliad and this heroic world that Odysseus has been inhabiting. Now that he's on the other side of the curtain, Achilles is looking back and saying, it would have been better had I not made those choices. Now, he doesn't actually say those words, though. What he says is it's better to be alive. But I think there's at least a possibility that presents itself is a kind of a reorientation away from that particular vision of what one ought to do with one's life.
Right. So he says, "Do not console me about death." I think there's a way of reading this, like you're saying. The Odyssey critiquing that sort of martial mindset, that the best thing is to just get glory, die young if you need to, but just win glory dying in battle, something like that. Whereas the Odyssey is more interested in like, well, let's get Odysseus home and let him live a long and happy life back with his family. So the one thought would be, well, Achilles maybe is adopting that Odyssean mindset here. But I think actually, what if he's maintaining his own previous mindset and suggesting, actually, no, death is miserable. It's pretty bad down here. And actually, Odysseus probably didn't diagnose the situation correctly to think he's somehow like lording over the dead. There's actually not really any evidence of that here.
Yeah, fair.
And that, no, it sucks to be dead. But what can I do? You have to die. Everyone has to die. So might as well go out in a blaze of glory if you're going to die. I would rather be the worst possible person alive than to be dead, but I can't. That's impossible.
Right. So he's not saying, I wish I had lived a long life as a dirt poor tenant farmer. He's saying that having been Achilles, I would prefer still to be alive, even in a diminished capacity.
Yeah.
Yet that beautiful little moment where Odysseus tells him, "The other Greek commanders were in tears, their legs were shaking, not your handsome boy. I never saw his face grow pale. He had no tears to wipe away. Inside the horse he begged me to allow him to jump out. He gripped his sword hilt and his heavy spear, so desperate to go hurt the Trojans. At last, when we had sacked the lofty city of Priam, he embarked, weighted down with spoils. No sharp bronze spear had wounded him at all. He was unhurt by all the skirmishes endured in war when Ares rages blind." I mean, it's a beautiful little testimony of what you would say to a dad. Like, he was so brave and he not a scratch on him. I mean, it's a generous friend to tell the story.
I think good evidence for Loney's reading, too, that, like, what Achilles wants to know is, did my boy do what I did? Like, did he become a hero? And so the notion that he's somehow repudiating that ethos entirely seems wrong. And he's pleased by it. Like, his shade is triumphant. And as Fagel says, lopes with long strides across the fields of Asphodel. a lovely image.
Put some alliteration in there.
That's right.
Gotta leave it to Fagels to...
Well, Fagels is good on that. Both these sort of little touches of alliteration, and then when he really wants to put an exclamation point on something, he'll lapse into iambic pentameter. It's a really interesting translation in that way.
So you have to face death, and what he kind of learns there is that it's better to be alive, and that there's a huge range of actions that lead to death. There's God involvement in death, and there's a risk. Your own moral actions could put you at greater risk for this, right? Don't eat the cattle.
Yeah.
Don't eat the cattle.
Yeah, so that was the Tiresias prophecy. Just to reiterate that, he's learned now, well, there are several different paths that could take you home. Right, the best one is if you just sail home, don't eat the cattle, you get home with your companions and attack. But if they touch the cattle, well, they're doomed. You can still make it home, late and in a bad way. It's best, right, nobody touches the cattle.
And I think I would add one more thing here is that, Odysseus has encountered these two heroes from his past, Agamemnon and Achilles. Both of them have asked him, how's my son? And Tiresias mentions Telemachus, right? He says that...
And so does his mom.
So does his mom, that's right. And Odysseus has a chance that Agamemnon and Achilles didn't have, which is the chance to get home and actually meet his son. To answer, while still alive, the questions that these heroes have after their deaths. That would seem to me to be a powerful motivation to make it back home.
All right, so book 12. After hitting the land of the dead, back to Circe to get instruction.
Mm-hmm.
And what do we do with this book as he goes through some of the most famous adventures? The Sirens, Scylla, Charybdis. How do we understand the narrative purpose of these books and the thematic purposes?
So, I mean, I guess narratively, this is how we get rid of all his men and the sort of last step on the journey to Calypso. Thematically, I think that the questions about responsibility come up in a really big way in this book. And also with the Sirens in particular, sort of, the question that we were just talking about in book 11, the lure of the world of the Trojan War versus the desire for homecoming to a more peaceful place. Right. And we were talking about this a bit before, but one of the things that may surprise people about the Sirens, if they know about them, that haven't read the poem, is that the lure of the Sirens, the song of the Sirens, is not a Calypso-like promise of you can sort of have me forever. What they have to offer is songs about the Trojan War. They're offering Odysseus another version of his own past. And that's the attraction, right? That's the thing he has to get tied to the mast in order to keep from running back to. Which in book 12, so we're halfway through the poem, roughly, and the first 12 books are not Ithaca. The second 12 books are Ithaca, so we're about to get there. And with the Sirens, one more time, we have the lure of that world.
Right. And you get something like an excessive hospitality, like come stay and enjoy this, right, for too long, and you'll just end up like bones on a beach eventually.
That's right, yeah. The lure of the past is fatal, it turns out.
Right. And then you get it's almost like things of heightening to your bit, because you get perhaps the most sort of naturalistic and monstrous threats that come in the end with Scylla and Charybdis. Scylla's like this sort of, absolute monstrous creature. You don't talk to Scylla. You don't have the kind of conversation you get with Polyphemus. She just comes and swoops in and eats people. And then the Charybdis, of course, is just a sure sort of natural disaster waiting to happen. So you get perhaps that mapped into extremes here, maybe.
So in what way, then, just to follow up on Weber's comment earlier, in what way does this unpack the idea of responsibility? Do you mean, for example, when Circe is giving instructions, he asks her, like, can we get out of this problem? Can we circumvent Charybdis, stop Scylla? Mm-hmm. And she says, no, you fool. Your mind is still obsessed with deeds of war, but now you must surrender to the gods. She is not mortal. She is deathless evil, terrible, wild, and
pure
cruel.
Evil.
You cannot fight her. And that is just such an interesting thing with regard to responsibility. Like, I can hero my way out of this.
Exactly. Yeah.
Is his kind of goal. Like, if I could just scheme, if I could think of a way. But there is no way at this moment. This is the terrible double bind. This is it. You have to basically agree to your men dying to get through this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a sad choice to have to make, but in a way not difficult, in the sense that if you're just weighing everybody in this whirlpool or just 6 of the companions, it's sort of obvious what you have to decide. So I wouldn't necessarily call it tragic in the sense that it's not like you're pitting together 2 things you can't reconcile. No, it's clear that you have to sort of...
Yeah.
Except they could just not go home. Or like, sorry, but if it was like... Sorry, Kriner, if you really want to get home, Weber and Loney have got to go. I'd be like, sorry, guys. I mean, obviously we could all die, or just you two could die in my desire to get home to my family. So, I don't know.
Yeah, so about that, I mean, the Scylla issue, the part to me that feels so difficult is Odysseus' decision not to tell his men about Scylla. Yeah. So I think that, the commander who says, this is our best bet, probably 6 of you are going to die. Mm-hmm. Almost certainly 6 of you are going to die. Versus the commander says, just go that way and it'll be fine.
It's going to be a hard battle, but we'll get through it, or something like that.
And that to me seems different in terms of how we think of Odysseus, even if the situation is the same. I also think of that he chooses to hear the Sirens song. So when Circe tells him about the Sirens, she does present it to him as a choice. She says, stop up your shipmates' ears, but if you are bent on hearing, have them tie you to the mast. If you've got to do it, this is how you do it, is what she says, not you have to do it. He does choose to do it, and so the lure of that heroic world is so strong, his desire to fight Scylla, his decision not to tell his men about the consequences of his choice. He is displaying that kind of like double-edged, great-souled heroic behavior.
Especially because he lies about that choice about the Sirens to the men also. My friends, the revelations Circe shared with me should not be kept a secret. She said we must avoid the voices of the otherworldly Sirens, and she says that I alone should hear their singing. she does say, here's what you do, blah,
Yeah.
blah, blah. But, that makes it sound like it's a command
It does.
from her to do that, which adds to that kind of, you're kind of in this for you thought for me anyway.
Yeah. The philologist in me is worried about that modal verb. What,
Fair. So
I alone
fair.
can hear their singing versus I alone should hear their singing in modern English are very different statements, and I haven't checked what the text says, but I do trust Emily Wilson, though. She too knows her modal verb. But you're right. And again, under the guise of what we would now call transparency, he actually lies a certain amount to his crew about what's going to happen.
I'll defend him a bit in the Scylla thing. I mean, is it that he thinks, actually, I could? Like, I could just dress up in armor and defeat her in battle, and so my 6 companions don't actually have to die. So maybe he thinks he can escape without them dying?
Yeah, it does say, I ignored Cersei's advice that I should not bear arms.
Mm-hmm.
And he doesn't mention Scylla because he thinks they would drop their oars and huddle down.
Yeah.
in the hole.
And maybe drive into Charybdis.
Right. So that's the threat. So I wonder if it's not just that, he doesn't tell them, 6 of you have to die, because maybe
He believes that
that 6 don't have to die.
Right.
Which is wrong.
But in some ways, being wrong about that is a lot easier to understand, I guess.
I mean, it's a classic move. Somebody gives you this set that, there's no hope.
Yeah.
And then,
But if I just muscle whip my way through it.
Yeah. But what's funny is in so many modern films or whatever, the hero makes this choice and actually succeeds. The people don't die.
Totally.
Right? Whereas here they do.
They do, and not just anybody, but the strongest and best. And the last thing they say is his name.
Ugh. And he says it's the most heartbreaking thing that he sees on his entire voyage.
mm-hmm.
So we should move to the cattle, yes?
Yes.
Don't eat the cows, don't eat the cows, don't eat the cows. He falls asleep, they eat the cows.
And then the cows kind of twitch and move.
Yeah, right. You talk about sort of a scene of beastly feasting.
To be fair, they're very hungry.
Exactly.
And they claim, it's a little unclear, but they claim that, we're just going to perish through starvation if we don't eat the cows, so might as well eat them and see what happens. We have to decide if we're going to take that on face value, or if it's just rhetoric because they just really want to eat meat. But in any case, they've been warned.
Yeah, multiple times. But I also, so part of talking about balance and excess, right, as we have been doing this whole time, one of the things that struck me on rereading this was that the omen, the hides crawling, the meat mooing, and all that stuff. And then they continue to eat the cattle for 6 more days. There's no suggestion in the poem that had they stopped right there and sacrifice to Apollo, that the disaster could have been averted. But at the same time, that once the meat you've butchered starts crawling towards you, you just keep eating it for 6 days does seem kind of monstrous.
Absolutely. We have so many parallel stories of that same move, where you try to muscle a god into doing what you want that god to do, and I'll just sacrifice really hard after it. I took the spoils you told me not to take, but I'm going to make sacrifices with them. See, or whatever.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
That's
Familiar, yeah.
Right. What you're referring to is the sense that he sets it up like they're going to make a thank offering to Helios, later.
Well, it's interesting because of the parallel with the offering that Odysseus is going to have to make to Poseidon. That's part of Tiresias' prophecy, is that whole thing with the oar and the sacrifices to Poseidon to appease him, presumably. Maybe part of the message is that, you can bargain with the gods on the gods' terms, but you can't bargain with the gods on your own terms, right? You don't get to just say, oh, yeah, it'll be fine, we'll just sacrifice to you later. But if the shade of a prophet comes out and says, well, this is what you do, that's a different story. But it's interesting to kind of see that parallel.
Mm-hmm. So then, because of all this, Helios gets pretty mad that his special cows are eaten. And then he threatens something actually kind of like an apocalypse. So Helios is kind of an ambiguous figure. We were talking earlier, right? That the sun is both the source of light and life for people, right? You can't live without the sun. And yet also quite threatening.
Yeah.
And we'll see later in book 22, there's this simile where the suitors die under the rays of the sun, like fish baked. So Helios is sort of ambivalent in that sense. And then he threatens, lines 380 and following, for they outrageously killed my cattle, in whom I always delighted on my way up to starry heaven, or when I turned back again from heaven toward earth. Unless these are made to give me just recompense for my cattle, I'll go down to Hades and give my light to the dead men. So I mean, it's sort of like apocalyptic. It's the sense of the sun is just going to go away. We're going to be left like in eternal darkness. And that, just for the sake of the companions, I mean, Zeus is sort of persuaded, no, I'll let them all die rather than shroud the entire universe in darkness.
The notion of just recompense here interests me too. That, like, it is just, or at least Helios believes it just, to kill all of Odysseus's men because they ate his cattle. Maybe is looking towards the same sort of justice being involved in Odysseus killing all of the suitors because they've consumed his goods.
That's right. That's the parallel I would make too.
The notion that it is actually a proportional response, I think, is interesting to me.
And with that, all the men die, and we end up with the gods helping Odysseus in his report to reach the island of the dreadful, beautiful, divine Calypso, who loved and cared for him. And then he breaks off. The end of this book is a really quick end, right? Why should I tell the story I told you and your wife yesterday? It's annoying repeating tales that have been told before. End. End of book there.
Got a little wink to the audience there. Us readers, you've already heard me say this.
I wonder if it's also a moment of characterization that Odysseus never tells the same story the same way twice. We'll see that happen, I think, more as we go on, because he has a chance to retell this story to some other people. He doesn't. He tells a different version. What he tells Penelope is an interesting question when we get there. But it feels, I think a wink to the audience is absolutely right, a way to kind of bring this to a close, but also just a sort of a nod to Odysseus's. He's just not the kind of person who's going to tell you the same thing twice.
No, he's a man of action, although involved in lies.
Or he's a man of twists and turns, right? And at one point, Wilson translates one of his epithets as Lord of Lies.
Lord of Lies. Hilarious. Can we give a preview where our reader's going next? Do we get home?
Yes.
We do. We make it to Ithaca.
Ithaca at last is what Phaedrus calls Book 13. So Ithaca at last.
Wait, if we get to Ithaca in Book 13, why are there so many more books?
Yes. So he's arrives in a very precarious situation where he has no help at first, right? He's got a bunch of loot that the Phaeacians gave him, but that's not going to help him defeat 108 suitors. So he's got to figure out how to navigate that situation. He also seems not to be sure of the fidelity of anybody in his household either. So he's got to feel that out too, to see who's actually on his side.
Yeah, twists and turns. But I think as a structural point, that is worth making, that it's 12 books to get Odysseus home, but also 12 books to deal with home. And so just in terms of what this poem is really about, again, the temptation to think of it as the struggles involved in arriving home is really strong, but that's actually not a fair description of the poem as a whole. Our movies all tend to end once, when the journey's done, the movie's done. That's not how this poem works.
Except we maybe mentioned earlier, the Lord of the Rings, right? It's a nice parallel to this.
Yes, that's right. The scouring of the Shire.
Exactly. It's a sort of internal homecoming. After you make it back from the journey, home has changed. And you got to sort of fix maybe what's gone wrong at home.
Yeah, home has changed and you have changed. And you have to find some way to bring those two things together again.
All that and more coming up in our next episode.
That's right.
Now it's time for the Have You Heard segment of our podcast. This is the time of the show where we share not precisely recommendations, but rather all the news about how the Odyssey is showing up in culture these days. You might have heard of some of these, you might not have. We thought it would be fun to share. We'd love to hear what you have to share if you would email core.studies@wheaton.edu. Hey, have you heard about Barbara Hamby's wild ride of poetry called Bird Odyssey? It encompasses 3 road trips, one across Siberia, one from Memphis to New Orleans on Highway 61, and one following the Odyssey from Troy to Ithaca. Hamby writes sassy road poems, and fans find her singing for our time too, with poems like The Lotos Eaters, Ode on My Pothead Nephews. Hamby's not the only one odysseying it up in poetry either. Nobel Prize-winning poet Louise Glick's volume Meadowlands takes a very different approach to the Odyssey, as she traces relationships using the Odyssey's character in lines that fans find spare and luminous. If you'd like to hear more about either of these, find links in our show notes. Thank you so much for listening. Do you have questions about the Odyssey that you'd like our Core Book podcast team to consider? Send your questions to core.studies@wheaton.edu by December 1st, and we'll consider them for our question and response episode, the last of our season. We might not be able to get to them all, but we'd love to hear from you. We'll be back next week with more nerd love. But if you miss us before then, visit www.wheaton.edu/corebook, or better yet, find someone to share the Odyssey with. With Core Book, as with all books, we read better together. The Core Book podcast is a production of the Core Book program at Wheaton College in partnership with the Aequitas Fellows Program in Public Humanities and Arts. Aequitas PHA is a creative studio and scholarship program that brings together 4-year cohorts of undergraduate student artists, theater makers, dancers, musicians, writers, and all manner of scholarly nerds to build publicly engaged projects in the humanities and arts. You can find out more about the program and all the Aequitas themes, including global public health, sustainability, politics, philosophy, and economics, and urban leadership at www.wheaton.edu/Aequitas. That's AEQUITAS. You can find out more about Core Book and look at our years of archives and reading materials for all our core books, from Shusaku Endo's Silence to Marilyn Robinson's Gilead, and Daniel Nayeri's Everything Sad is Untrue at www.wheaton.edu/corebook. Our podcast is produced by the endlessly capable Emma Smith. Music is by Tristan Guzman. Art is by Lily Groves and Cecilia Waidatt, with audio editing by Emma Smith. Our Sassy student summarizers are Zoe Foster-Whiddon, Houston Heinrich, and Emma Smith. Special thanks to the Wheaton College Aequitas Fellows Program in Public Humanities and Arts, Bailey Garrison, Mariah Sray, Anna Porter-Puckett, Karina Adamowicz, Linda Bretz, Sray Austriaco, Rebecca Larson, Les Barker, and the Wheaton College Marketing and Communications Department.